Hello. So in my last video I talked about how most scholars date the book of Daniel to about the mid-2nd century BCE, but it is a little bit more complex than that, so let's talk about it. So we have 8 manuscripts of Daniel that we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the earliest fragments that we have date to the late 2nd century or the very early 1st century BCE. What makes this more interesting is that chapters 1 and then chapters 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew, and then 2 verse 4 through 7 verse 28 is written in Aramaic, and we have parts of the non-canonical version of Daniel that are written in Greek. So why is this important? Well, linguists are able to compare these texts to other older or younger texts and compare the style of language used. Now there's a ton of complex detail here, but I'm going to try and summarize. So let's start with the Aramaic. Scholars have taken the Aramaic parts of Daniel and compared them against papyri that they've unearthed. First we have the Elephantine papyri, which was from the 5th century BCE. Then we have the Samaria papyri, which is the 4th century BCE. And then we have the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran that date between 200 BCE and 70 CE. The Elephantine papyri uses the letter Z, but in later Aramaic we see Z replaced with the consonant D. And we see this shift in both Daniel, Ezra, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. This suggests that Daniel uses a later form of Aramaic than the Elephantine papyri. Now that's one example of many, but I have a time limit, so we're going to leave it at that. The Book of Daniel also uses later Aramaic, where the Samaria papyri uses older versions. And finally, the version of Aramaic used in Daniel seems slightly older than the Dead Sea Scrolls, but not by much. So the scholarly consensus is that the Aramaic in Daniel dates to later than the 4th century Samaria papyri, but earlier than the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Aramaic in the Dead Sea Scrolls dates to about the 2nd century BCE. Now scholars have divided the Hebrew language into 4 stages: Archaic, Standard, Transitional, and Late Biblical Hebrew. The term Late Biblical Hebrew is applied to the books that were written during the Second Temple period, or the Restoration period. 2 of the ways that scholars date this are vocabulary preferences and syntactical and grammatical features. That's really hard to say. Daniel uses later versions of the first-person pronoun I, and also a specific grammatical construction that's found about 50 times in the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran that is dated to the 2nd century BCE. There's also a common verbal form called the infinitive absolute that is found in Daniel only once and is an older idiomatic form. Basically, the use of an infinitive absolute followed by a finite verb of the same root is on decline in late biblical Hebrew. Scholars also use a lot of historical dates, but it's complex and wouldn't lend itself to a 1 or 3 minute video. Hope this helped.